Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video, we're going to have a build and final review of the 1/72nd Scale Academy PBM Martin Mariner, and we're going to be attempting to build it in the RAAF scheme that's included in the recent reissuing of this kit. So previously, I've done an inbox review, so if you haven't seen it, go check it out. But today we'll be finally answering the question, does it have all the parts to make the RAAF scheme? And we'll see if it actually builds nicely. The first step, as with all my other models, is to give all the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or residue from the moulding process so that the paint and glue will adhere to the model, and then I begin to assemble the interior of the aircraft. Most of the interior of this plane is completely sparse, but there is a really nicely detailed cockpit floor section which also includes an engineer and navigator's position behind the pilots. I use a pair of Tamiya side cutters to remove the seats, the instrument panels and the floor and other small parts from the sprue, and then I use a bit of Revell Contactor Professional to glue some of the parts to the cockpit floor. I decided to only glue the rudder pedals, the trim wheels and the seats to the cockpit floor at first to make it a little bit easier to paint. I also assembled and then attached the tables that house the radio equipment and also all of the other seats and the two control columns for the pilots. Any parts that had any switches or other raised details on them I decided to paint separately, so when I removed them from the sprue I left a little bit extra sprue attached to them to use as a handle to hold onto while painting them. Following this I cut out the fuselage halves and also the landing gear doors, and rather than gluing in the entire landing gear bay I simply glued the doors to the fuselage to make it the non-amphibious version of the Mariner. The only other part that had any detail for the interior was the nose wheel bay, which has a little bit of an anti-slip texture on the top for inside of the aircraft. At this point I gave some of the interior parts a coat of flat black, such as the radio and engineer's panels and the main instrument panel, and then I set the parts aside to dry. In the meantime I used a bit of Deluxe Materials odorless rocket CA glue to glue some foam to the inside of the hull. I had secretly harboured ambitions to try and make this aircraft float, so I decided to put in a little bit of emergency flotation so that if it did take on a leak it wouldn't sink to the bottom of a swimming pool. The other thing I added to the interior of the hull was a little bit of sidewall detailing. To do this I used some strips of Tamiya 1mm masking tape and put it into place to create some horizontal and vertical ribbing inside of the hull. Once the ribbing was in place, it was time to paint the interior. I decided to go with Vallejo 70954 yellow-green for the interior walls and the cockpit floor, since this colour is pretty close in my opinion to the more yellow shades of US Army and Navy zinc chromat colours. To apply the paint, I squeeze a bit out of the bottle onto an area of the model that I don't really care too much about being visible, and then I use a little bit of water mixed with a brush to help spread the paint around. I like to keep the coats nice and thin to help reduce the visibility of any brush strokes, not that it matters an awful lot for the interior of the hull, seeing as it's pretty hard to see through anything through the small windows. After painting 3 coats of the yellow-green on the interior parts, and doing a second coat of flat black on the instruments, I start to paint the finer details. On the flight deck, I paint the pilot and co-pilot's seat and armrests X1 gloss black, the control columns, the trim wheels and the rear seat cushions with Vallejo flat black, and I use a bit of flat earth to paint the wooden areas on the radio tables and also on the armrests for some of the seats in the rear of the flight deck. Sadly there aren't any decals included for any of the instrument panels, but there are some fantastic raised details, so I decided to have a go at painting them. To do this, I started off with some Vallejo flat white to paint the various controls and switches and gauges. I used various techniques such as a bit of dry brushing on some of the smaller and larger raised detail areas, and for small gauges which were sunken details I mixed the paint with a little bit of water to help it flow, and then I dabbed the brush into the recesses and helped the white flow into it to create a white backdrop for all of the gauges. After the white had dried, the next colour I used was some X1 gloss black. I dabbed it into the centre of the gauges, trying to keep a little bit of the white trim visible to help create the middle of the gauges. Other details were painted with various colours, such as a little bit of Vallejo Vermillion red for some of the red instruments and dials, some flat yellow for the yellow ones, and also some dark Luftwaffe green for some of the green ones. The seats and tables on the flight deck received a third coat of their respective colours, and the tables for the radio equipment received a coat of natural wood and dark grain wood grain effects from Vallejo to give them a more wooden texture, and then it was time for a bit of weathering. I used a dry brushing technique to apply some XF16 flat aluminium onto the floor, the sidewalls and the instrument panels to create some metal chipping effects, and followed this up with a coat of Tamiya's enamel black panel wash to highlight some of the details and give the interior a little bit of a more dirty appearance. After I'd applied one coat, I used some enamel thinners to remove the excess and make the coat a little bit thinner, and then I decided to create a little bit of a more dirty look on the cockpit floor by using some of the rust and dirt coloured weathering powders from Tamiya. I also used the lighter sand and dirt colours on the seats and the tables to give them a bit of a worn appearance as well. I used a small brush to dab some Vallejo gloss varnish onto the gauges to make them look like they were made out of glass, and then I started to glue into place the radio stacks, the engineer's panel, and the pedestal and the main instrument panel for the pilots. As with most float aircraft, the throttle controls are on the roof between the two pilots. I decided to paint the area where they would go flat black on the inside, and then use a little bit of metal wiring to create some throttle controls. I also made up some small sections of cable that had been twisted up to give it a little bit of a wrapped effect, and then I glued it into place around the various instrument panels using some rocket odorless CA glue to add some extra details. Once the wiring was in place and dried, I then painted it flat white, and I also painted the throttle and engine controls flat white and vermilion red. With the interior complete, I could finally glue the cockpit flight deck to the interior of the aircraft, and then I decided to make the first mistake, which was to not use the included clear parts and instead glue the fuselage halves together without using them. I could have used them, which was the stupid thing, because there were some very nice masks included in this kit that were pre-cut. However, I decided to not use them, thinking instead I would use some other materials to create the windows, which, as you'll see much later on, did not work out very well. The only window I did put in place was the cockpit window once the fuselage halves had been joined, which only required a little bit of sanding to get it to fit down nicely and remove the excess sprue. The fuselage halves fitted together very nicely even with the internal modifications, so I taped it up and let it dry, and in the meantime began to assemble the wings. Once they were cut out and cleaned up, I then glued the lower section to the middle section and then glued the two outer sections onto the lower wings. They fitted together alright, however there was a pretty large gap between the three upper sections for the wings. There was some included details for the inside of the bomb bay, which is inside the engine nacelle. However, since the Australian mariners were converted to transport duties, the bomb bays would have been sealed up. So I didn't bother with including any of the interior details and instead simply glued the bomb bay doors on in the closed position. I then cut out the parts and assembled the 4 air intakes for the engines. I'd later have to take them off because the Australian mariners used a different engine. However, I decided to still put them in place temporarily and use them as a base for the fairings to modify. There were a few parts that were a bit fiddly on them, mainly the front of the air intakes. However, they fitted really nicely into the engine nacelles without too much issue and no gap at all. Next came the vertical and the horizontal stabilizer. All of these parts are assembled in a pretty similar fashion. For the main part of the horizontal stabilizer, there are 3 pieces, one single large upper section and then 2 lower halves so that it fits nicely together. There's also separate elevators which have 2 halves, and if you glue them together while they're attached to the main part of the horizontal stabilizer but you don't glue them to the stabilizer itself, you'll be able to pose the elevators. The rudders and the vertical stabilizer are assembled in pretty much the identical fashion, and the fit on all of these parts is pretty good. I think it's pretty nice that you have the option to pose the controls. Once I'd assembled the rudders and the vertical stabilizers, I then glued them onto the horizontal stabilizer. They come in at a slight angle, but fortunately there's 2 struts that fit onto the horizontal and vertical stabilizers, which help line them up and make them nice and strong. Moving back to the hull and wings, I discovered that the area where the astrodome is, which is on the roof section that's part of the wings, was not see-through on the hull, so I decided to use my knife and sprue cutters to remove some of the excess hull so that you could have a little bit of light coming in from the astrodome into the hull. Once I'd done this, I sanded away some of the excess plastic on the roof of the aircraft so that the wings would join nicely, and I started to remove the masking tape. Once the masking tape was removed, the process of sanding down some of the excess sprue and the seam line and then filling in the gaps with putty began. I tried to put a little bit of extra putty on the underside of the aircraft to help make it nice and watertight, for the same reason I put the foam inside the aircraft, although I probably should have glued the nose wheel cover in place before doing the putty. I was able to fill it in later. I made another mistake at this stage to do with the front window. Believing that there was no option to have the window covered up, I ended up using putty to fill in the area. I later found out that I just didn't understand how step number 20 worked, and I did later fix this up. I ran a bead of putty around the seam line where the landing gear cover would be so that I could later sand it nice and smooth and make it look like there was no cover for the landing gear, as it was not the amphibious version. I then removed the masking tape from the wings and glued them and the horizontal and vertical stabilizers to the hull of the aircraft. The wings and the hull didn't fit perfectly together, and there was a bit of a gap below the wings, which was a bit tricky to reach for sanding and filling, but fortunately the horizontal stabilizer fitted quite nicely. Since it was the transport version used by the RAAF, I used the included fairings to fill in the turrets. Although this was perfectly alright for the mid turret, technically this is not correct for a RAAF Mariner for the rear turret. All of the Mariners that I've seen from the Australian Air Force had a small clear section at the tail turret. Unfortunately, the parts to do the Australian Mariner are not included, even though there are extra decals to do one. I did consider scratch building a clear section, and there is also some conversion kits, but I decided I wanted to finish the Mariner just with what I had and using my own techniques, so I decided that it was good enough for me to just have the ventral turret faired over without the extra windows. Strangely, the kit does include the correct nose section for the Mariner without the turret, so I don't know why they haven't bothered with the rear section. The other issue is the engines in the Australian aircraft were the earlier type, however we'll talk about that a little bit later. Getting back to the build, I finally realised that A10 and A9 were in fact the doors that cover over the clear window, and that B8 was referring to the hull of the aircraft. So I used a knife to scratch away the excess putty and then glued the two parts into place. They didn't fit perfectly because I wasn't able to get all of the putty cleared, but it was still definitely an improvement over trying to just use putty to fill the entire gap. Much like the elevators and the rudder, the ailerons and flaps in this kit can be posed. They come in two halves which you attach onto a small hinge, and provided you don't glue the hinge to the parts, you can join the two halves of the flap or aileron together and they will be able to be moved. I know not everyone's going to be fussed over this feature, but I thought it was pretty cool being someone who does a lot of animations with things. And even if you don't care for having them movable, at least you can choose whether or not to have the flaps deployed and the ailerons in a certain position for, say, a diorama. Unfortunately, I did break the hinges on the left side while I was handling the aircraft and painting it, so you do have to be a little bit careful if you don't want to break them because they're quite fragile hinges. The next part I added on, speaking of fragile, was the floats. In hindsight, I really should have put them on after I'd painted the model because there were a few times where I accidentally knocked the floats off or broke the struts on them. But apart from the struts being very thin parts that are quite delicate, they do fit to the wing quite nicely, and after you've joined the float halves together, you can then attach them to the struts and they fit alright. And with everything major attached to the aircraft, except for some of the smaller pitot tubes and other delicate parts, I decided to give the aircraft a little bit more of a go over with the putty, using a cocktail stick to help get it into some of the trickier gaps, such as where the lower wings meet the hull. And after I'd filled in all of the gaps, I then waited for 24 hours for the putty to dry, and went over it with various grades of sandpaper to sand it down so it was nice and smooth. After the sanding, I got out my Tamiya panel line scribing tool and rescored some of the panels that I'd sanded over. I should have probably done this a little bit slower, and it probably would have been better if I'd used some masking tape to help keep the lines nice and straight, but I am getting a little bit better with a bit of practice. If you've watched my inbox review of this kit, you'll know that the kit comes with a very nice set of pre-cut masks. I only really needed the masks for the main canopy since the mid-turret and ventral turret were faired over, and I'd made the very dumb decision to not use the included windows. However, there are masks included for all of the turrets and said side windows. I used some blue tack to fill in the side windows and the nose turret along with a little bit of paper, and then put the aircraft into a cardboard box and gave it a little bit of a prime. I don't usually use primer on my models since most of the time I find the paint sticks to them just fine, but for this one, seeing as I was considering putting it on a bit of water, I thought it might be wise just to make sure the paint had definitely gripped to it. I gave the aircraft 2 coats of Vallejo's white primer, which I found was pretty good, and after it had dried I brought the aircraft back inside. The coat of primer revealed some of the gaps, especially the ones on the upper surface of the wing, and in some of the areas where I'd made mistakes with the scribing tool. So to fix it up, I used a little bit of Vallejo's water-based putty and carefully filled in some of these gaps using a cocktail stick. I then used my finger with a little bit of water on it to help remove the excess putty, and after I'd rescribed a couple of the extra lines that had gotten a little bit lost under either the primer or possibly from the sanding, it was time for some painting. The Academy kit includes one set of markings for a Royal Australian Air Force Mariner, A70-5. In the marking guide, it suggests the aircraft was painted overall in foliage green. However, I have found a few pictures of the aircraft, and as you can see in some of them, there's definitely a lighter colour on the underside, which is probably a sort of medium sea grey or possibly even a light blue. I haven't been able to find any other coloured pictures of Mariners, and some other decal guides seem to suggest they were either in the foliage green all over, or in some other cases either the single or the two-tone blues and the light grey from the US Navy. Where Australia actually got their Mariners from, I'm a little unsure. I have heard rumours that they may have been ex-British ones that were intended for the Fleet Air Arm but were rejected because the British preferred the Sunderland. One thing I've noticed in a lot of photos is there appears to be a lot of paint patchwork at the nose of the aircraft, and a particular marking that seems to be common in a fair few of them that looks like the original US Navy roundel that's been painted over. It could be that these are ex-Navy Mariners that are still in the blue and they just decided to overspray the roundels, or possibly some sort of censorship. The decals included for the Mariner A705 also include a pin-up, but if we look in pictures of the aircraft, it's not seen. However, there is a small circular area which is a slightly different shade of colour, so it's possible that these were painted over at some stage because of censorship. I've seen a lot of the other decal options include pin-ups, but I've only ever found one picture of a Mariner from the RAAF that had one, so it's a bit hard to tell what's going on. Perhaps someone else out there has a little bit more knowledge, but in the end I decided to go with a overall foliage green with the grey underside and have a lot of patchwork and the area where the pin-up should be painted in a slightly different shade. For this colour scheme, the lighter colour, which is the one I usually start with, was going to be the grey underside. I chose to go with Tamiya XF83 Medium Sea Grey RAAF for this particular colour because I think it's a close match, and I've found that this particular Tamiya colour is generally pretty consistent and of good quality. To apply the paint, I used my normal technique of mixing the paint with a little bit of water and then applying it onto the aircraft in the same direction as much as possible, usually in the same direction air would flow over the model. I keep the coats of paint very thin using the water so that it reduces the brush strokes and in the end will deliver a much more smoother and more uniform looking finish. For the RAAF foliage green, I decided in the end to go with Vallejo Gunship Green 70895. I'd spent a fair bit of time trying to find a green that I was happy with, since the RAAF green is a pretty tricky colour to get right in my opinion. But I was really happy with how the Vallejo colour turned out in the end, so I decided to stick with it after the first coat. I ended up doing around about 3 or 4 coats of the medium sea grey 2 on the underside and about 3 coats of foliage green on the upper surface. This obviously took quite a long time as the Mariner is a pretty big aircraft. At this point I'm sure a lot of people are saying, get an airbrush, but I didn't really want to experiment with an airbrush on this particular kit, and again it's still a bit of a space and expertise issue for me setting one up, so I stuck with the hand painting even though it took probably around about 4 or 5 hours to paint the aircraft after all the coats. And as you can see, after adding all of these coats of paint, I ended up with a pretty nice finish that didn't have many brush strokes at all, and it was nice and uniform. As I've mentioned, a lot of pictures of A70-5 show with a fair bit of patchwork and different coloured areas, so I decided to have a bit of an experiment and try and replicate this. I noticed at the front of the aircraft, around the cockpit canopy, there were a lot of areas that were a lot lighter, along with the large sort of round painted over area where the pin-up used to be, possibly, and also where the registration was, there appeared to be a little bit more of a paint overlap. On other Mariner pictures, I found that the wings looked pretty patchy as well in quite a few areas, and also the fabric control surfaces seemed to be consistently a lighter colour. With this in mind, I decided to begin by mixing a little bit of Vallejo flat white with the Gunship green and painting some of the areas that I wanted to be a little bit lighter. This was mainly the area where the pinup was and the panels aft of the cockpit. I made sure to mix a fair bit of water in with this paint to make it nice and thin so that the effect wouldn't be too strong, and for some of the areas where I wanted them to be even lighter, I just used straight flat white mixed with a fair bit of water to keep it nice and thin. This included the fabric on the various control surfaces, on the tops of the wing tanks, which always looked a little bit worn out, and also on various panels and access hatches on the wings of the aircraft. In the end, the straight white with a bit of water meant that it was a little bit speckly because I'd thinned it down so much, which wasn't ideal, but it still did look a lot better and more worn out. I gave these lighter areas a chance to dry, and in the meantime painted the front canopy, which I'd kept separate, with Gunship green. I then went over the cargo door at the front of the aircraft with Gunship green to make it a little bit darker, as well as some of the area around the pinup, and then for a bit of difference I used some Tamiya dark green 2 RAAF to paint the area around the registration. I used a cocktail stick to neaten up the front canopy, and after that I was ready to apply the decals, which unfortunately had somehow ended up getting damaged when I had the model sitting in the cupboard. I had it out of the sheet, so it's possible that it was scratched. Fortunately, I was able to find some replacement flags and also a spare E, although they were a bit older decals, so they did tear apart. As for the Australian decals, which are printed by Ronin Graphics Australia, the quality of them was pretty good. I have had a lot of aftermarket decals not be so good and quite fragile, but these ones are pretty nice and sturdy, and after they'd been sat in a little bit of warm water and then slid onto the model, I gave them a coat of Vallejo's decal softener, followed by a coat of Tamiya decal adhesive, and in the end the result was pretty nice. After I dabbed away any excess, I left the decals to dry for 24 hours, and in the meantime removed the masks from the cockpit frame and turned my attention towards the engines. When it comes to the engines included in the Academy kit, unfortunately again this is a case of the parts being incorrect for the Australian Mariners. The engines included for the kit are the R2800 Double Wasp. This one's an 18-cylinder radial engine and was used on the later versions of the Mariner to give it just a little bit more power since it had been struggling with the R2600. Unfortunately, the Australian Mariners all use the R2600, and given that this has 14 cylinders and the engine cowling is a lot less aerodynamic and smooth, there's quite a noticeable difference between these two engines. As I've mentioned, I didn't feel like spending the extra money on a conversion kit, so instead I decided to use Blender to make a model of the R2600 and some better cowlings, and then I used my trusty Anycubic 6K Mono to 3D print them. In the end, I got a pretty good result, although the engine cowlings are a little bit thin and fragile. I do have the STL file that I made available for purchase from my Cults page, so if you want to download it and print it yourself, you can get it there. I used a bit of Vallejo's water-based putty to fill in some of the holes from the supports on the engine cowlings and some of the areas where they'd cracked a tiny bit because of how thin I'd made them, and while waiting for that to dry, I painted the engines. I used XF16 flat aluminium in 2 coats for the base of the engine, followed by some XF24 dark grey on the centre of the engine where the gearbox is, a little bit of titanium gold on the various wires and the exhausts, flat black on some other smaller details, and finally some Vallejo yellow-green on some of the wiring. I then glued the engines into place and gave them a coat of Tamiya panel liner scent to highlight their details and give them a bit more of a dirty and oily look, and then I moved back to the engine cowlings, giving them a few coats of yellow-green and then modifying the aircraft so that the cowlings would fit. This involved using my sprue cutters to remove the 4 air intakes so that the cowling and the engines would fit, and then patching up the area by using a bit of polystyrene sheet to cover up the hole on the upper surface, and a spare air intake was then cut in half and used to create a little bit more filling between the upper air intake and to create the one at the bottom. I then glued the engine cowling to the airframe and used a little bit of Vallejo putty to help smooth in the gaps and fill in the holes, and once that had dried I gave it a little bit of a sanding to make it smooth. I probably could have repeated this process a couple times to get a slightly smoother and more seamless result, but in the end I was happy enough with how it turned out. After brushing away the excess putty, I gave the engine cowling a couple coats of both the medium grey 2 and the foliage green from Vallejo on the upper surface, before getting out the 4-bladed propeller option that's included in the kit and giving it a few coats of flat black on the propeller blades. Next, it was time for a little bit of weathering, starting off with some chipping. To create some metal chipping effects on various areas, I use a very fine brush and some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium, and after making sure the paint on the brush is relatively dry, I dab it onto the areas where I want to create some metal chipping where the paint has worn away. I apply it quite heavily handed around the areas such as the leading edges of the wings, the horizontal and the vertical stabilizers, and also on the edges of the engine cowling, which would be exposed to the airflow and maybe chip away with a bit of air resistance. Other areas include the access hatches and doors on the aircraft, areas where the crew are likely to do a lot of maintenance such as the sides of the engine cowling and on the floats, and also along some of the panel lines to create some extra scratches and damage from over time. This is pretty usual for me when I'm doing my aircraft. The only areas that might have received some extra chipping were on the underside of the hull and the sides. I did this seeing as the Mariner is a flying boat, there would likely be a fair bit of water resistance that causes a bit of paint to get chipped away over time, and also the use of a lot of dinghies or boats coming up against the aircraft would probably cause a few scratches over time. While I have the flat aluminium out, I also paint the propeller hubs and give them a little bit of chipping, and then after giving the flat aluminium a couple hours to dry, I come along with some of the foliage green from Vallejo and dab it over the areas where I've done some metal chipping. I focus this mainly on the edges, and this helps to soften the effect, reducing how many chips there are, making the effect more subtle, and also giving it the impression that there's a little bit of layering and that the paint was on top of the metal chipping and got chipped away, rather than I've applied the chipping over the paint. It's a pretty subtle effect, but I think it gives a really nice result when you do it very nicely over the top of it. I repeat this technique with the XF83 medium grey on the underside of the aircraft, and also a little bit on the propeller blades with the flat black. Once it was dry, I then got out some Tamiya black panel liner scent to create some extra weathering and also some post-shading effects. I apply it using the applicator largely on the sides of the aircraft, but also streaking backwards from the engines and on all of the access hatches on the upper surface of the wings and on the flaps and control surfaces. In some of these areas, I pull it backwards using the applicator to create a bit of a streaking effect as if there's been some leaks or streaks over time. As you can see, the effect is really quite strong, so once it's dried, I then get out some Tamiya enamel thinners, and using a cotton tip or a small brush, I rub away the excess black to remove it and help soften the effect, and also to help it flow into more of the recesses, creating some more realistic post-shading and weathering. In some areas, I'd remove the excess and then let it dry, and then repeat this process again with the enamel thinners to remove even more, until I was happy with how the effect turned out. I found for areas where I wanted to have some slightly smaller streaking effects, such as on the access hatches on the upper surface of the wing, it was a little bit easier to use a brush to gradually remove the excess enamel from the areas where I didn't want it, and also to help soften up the areas where I did want it and help streak them back a little bit further. Next, I got out some of my Tamiya weathering powder master set, and using the black and a little bit of water, I created some exhaust streaks coming back from the engine cowling. I used a little bit of a swirling motion to give it a slightly softer shape to it, and then sort of streaked it backwards to create the effect of air pushing back the soot and exhaust streaks. Because the weathering powders are water-based, you can always apply them and then using a little bit of water on the brush, remove some of the excess and help soften the effect. As well as exhaust streaks, I used the weathering powder to create some rust effects on the underside of the hull. To do this, I used the rust-coloured powder, and using a much finer brush and a fair bit of water, I put it on some of the panel lines to help create a very subtle effect of rust building up in some of the areas on the underside. I decided to experiment with Vallejo's 73828 wet effects by applying it onto the underside of the hull and the floats, and also in a little bit of a splash area around the rear of the aircraft to create a wet appearance as though the aircraft had just taken off or was still sitting on water and was a little bit wet. I applied it in a brush along the waterline and in the areas where on reference pictures the water would splash up to, and then I used some Tamiya black weathering powder to create a waterline mark on the side of the hull. With most of the handling of the aircraft complete, I decided to attach some of the smaller antenna parts before addressing the windows. As I've mentioned previously, I really should have just used the kit included windows and glued them in before attaching the two fuselage halves together, and then just used the masking tape to cover them over that's included, but I did not. I instead planned to use Deluxe Materials Looks Like Glass to try and create a glass effect by filling in the gaps for the windows using a cocktail stick and a bit of the material. As you can see, I tried, but it didn't seem to work. Even when I did manage to fill over the windows, I then found that a little bit later they would pop and I'd end up with a bit of a mess. I did try for quite a while to get it to work, but it seems that most of the windows on the Mariner were just too large, and also the upper windows have a bit of a curvature to them, which means that it wasn't very easy to try and get the material into place. Unfortunately, I didn't have any micro crystal clear, although I will be ordering some to hopefully use in the future for something like this. So I had to use an emergency backup, which was a little bit of clear decal paper. I have some that I use for printing on, but sometimes I have some spare offcuts, which are completely transparent. However, you have to very carefully apply them and make sure they're dead flat, otherwise you end up with wrinkles. The other issue with them is you'll end up with a patch that's all glossy where the decal was applied, but fortunately you can use a bit of matte varnish to dull this effect and make sure only the window is glossy. It's a bit of a last resort, but oh well, it's all I had for the meantime, but I'm sure I'll fix it up later. Following this, I painted the yellow on the tips of the propeller blades and Gunship green on the antennas, which I glued onto the cockpit area, and then I used a bit of super glue to glue some reflective mirror-like packaging into the gaps where the landing lights are, before then popping on the landing light itself. Once the window decals had dried overnight, I then applied a little bit of matte varnish with a fine brush around the edges of the window to make it dull there but keep the glossy effect for the window, and with that I decided to call the Academy 1/72nd scale Martin Mariner completed. And here you can see a few pictures of the final result, and I have to admit this is definitely not my proudest work. I think there are a lot of things I can improve on, but on the whole it was a pretty fun kit to build. It was very difficult to film this one because of just how big it is. I'm really happy with how the weathering effects turned out, especially the streaking and the water effects. It was a bit of an experiment and I think it really paid off. And I'm really happy with how my metal chipping turned out. I think I've really captured the weathered look of a lot of the RAAF Mariners pretty well. Although I'm sure some people are going to think it's a little heavy-handed, you can always lighten it up yourself if you're doing this kit. As for the kit itself, I think it goes together really quite well. There's some really nice detail in the cockpit. It's a bit of a shame the hull itself is empty, but you can't really see too much through those tiny windows anyways. The masks worked really nicely on the canopy, and I'm really regretting not having used the included window parts and stuck them in the hull before gluing the halves together, but oh well, I thought the deluxe material stuff would work for the purposes I wanted it to, but it wasn't quite designed for that. One thing I really don't like about this kit is that they included the Australian decals, but you can't really make an accurate version of the RAAF Mariner. I mean, sure, you can ignore the fact that the engines are different and the turrets are, or the windows at the tail turret are not included, but I know a lot of people are not going to be happy at all with that, and I'm sure some people are going to make comments about my not purchasing of a conversion kit, but I really just wanted to build this aircraft out of the box with as few modifications as possible, except for obviously the engines, because I didn't really have too much of a choice there, and I'm just going to live with the lack of windows at the tail. So yeah, a bit of a shame you can't really get the conversion kit without decals anyway, so there's not really much point in them including the Australian decals. But I'm sure if you're just doing the American version out of the box, it's really fantastic. For what I paid for this kit, which was $65, and that's Australian dollars by the way, so for all my American viewers know, I was not ripped off. I think it's a pretty good value for money kit. It's absolutely massive, and I'd usually expect to pay something closer to $80, especially considering that it's pretty nicely detailed. Given that it's so cheap for a large aircraft, it probably isn't too much of a stretch for most people to buy the conversion kit to make it a proper RAAF one. But in my opinion, it's pretty annoying to have decals included that you can't even use, especially when there was a little bit of hype over it having RAAF markings. But that being said, it also has quite a few options for things like fairing over the turrets and the non-turreted nose, which are good for the US Navy Mariners. So yeah, at least there's a few options still included in the kit. And it's wonderful anyways to have it back in 72nd scale and available. It's not as famous as the Catalina, but the Mariner still was a very important aircraft in both the Pacific and the Atlantic during the war. So for flying boat enthusiasts, it's great to have it back. And if it wasn't such a big aircraft, I'd possibly be tempted to do another one. But yeah, there's too many projects at the moment for me. However, there was one final thing that had to be done now that the Mariner was completed. So, disappointingly, the 172nd scale Martin Mariner from Academy will not float. But fortunately, it was alright after it was drained out and left outside to help dry it out, and it's good as new again. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel as well. It really helps out. And a big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying these kits, especially this one and all of the paints and supplies that I've used. If you have any questions or any suggestions for myself and fellow modelers, leave it down in the comment section below. And thanks again for watching, and until next video, take care, and as always, model on.